Hello, I'm back for social theory today, and after taking a look at how things went with the last video, I realized that the lamp I had on was reflecting on my glasses and it was really glary, so I'm sorry about that. Hopefully it's not too distracting in the last video. So, now that we've gone through some of the classical sociological theorists, we're going to be looking at the more contemporary state of sociological theory. So the good news is that contemporary sociological theory does build on and develop in dialogue with the classics. So there's going to be some familiar themes and ideas coming through here that will, hopefully come out quite clearly to you. So much like the earlier sociology, contemporary kind of 20th and even 21st century sociology or sociological theory is again divisible into macro and micro perspectives. So the macro, more kind of structuralist perspective that was favoured by Marx and Durkheim is kind of continued through by contemporary sociological theorists, as is a more micro perspective. So the kind of interactionist sociology favoured by Weber, who was trying to understand everyday life and the meanings people ascribe to things, and the reality not only of their lives but of how they understood their own lives, and what things looked like from their perspective. So that's really at the heart of a kind of micro perspective type of sociological theory, and that carries through quite strongly to some of the contemporary or more recent theory that we're going to be talking about. So again, to introduce you to some categorizations to help you kind of reduce all of the complexity and the noise. The first one here, as I've just said, is the kind of macro and micro again. And then within this kind of macro theory, there's really two strands in our contemporary kind of theory. So that is the kind of conflict approach. So very much like Marx, this is theory that's concerned with inequality, with clashing values within society. And then on the other hand, there's functionalist or consensus sociology, which is concerned with consensus, harmony, norms. So this is very much what the type of thing that Durkheim was working on. So he was interested in social order and what happens when we do not have social order, when norms break down. Remember, we spoke about his work on suicide. So that's very much, again, what the kind of functionalist or consensus sociological tradition is getting at. So that's what we're going to focus on now, these two branches of macro types of theorizing that are still very much alive and working today. So I've also included this table. I won't go through it now because I think you've probably had enough of me talking about kind of abstract categorizations with you. But I think if you're feeling a bit confused as you're listening to this, come back to this table just to make sure that you have a good sense of what's meant by some of the major theoretical perspectives that we've been talking about today. So starting off with functionalism, which again is one of the kind of branches of this macro, like whole society, large-scale type of theorizing. So the functionalist paradigm is really epitomized by the work of Talcott Parsons, who was an American sociologist working in kind of mid-20th century. And he was interested in kind of analyzing society as kind of a series of interlocking systems. So you can think about it kind of as society as an organism with parts, working together. So not always, as it says here on the slides, not always necessarily harmoniously working together, but working together nonetheless, because even within a functionalist system, there's always going to be some level of dysfunction. So Parsons argued, much like Durkheim, that different parts of society were serving different kind of functions. So the family would be kind of the locus of socialization, work as a productive center, school again as a field for kind of secondary types of socialization. He argued that all of these aspects of society were held together by a consensus of values, by shared ideas about what the world should be. So, social norms in much the way that, again, Durkheim was talking about. And he argued that people or parts of the system that did not fit within this kind of range of what was viewed as normal were seen as deviant, which deviant meaning literally to deviate from a norm. So Parsons used the ideas of kind of normative and deviant groups to analyze individuals and groups in society. So, those that conform to the status quo and those who acted against the status quo. And these are labels that can have quite strong moral connotations, but as we're going to discuss in the week in which we focus a bit on subcultures, there's not really too much creativity and progress without some measure of deviance, of pushing back against the status quo. So I think that's in kind of a way in which we can argue against an overly harmonizing theory of society. So for Parsons, institutions were made up not of people necessarily, but of the kind of roles that they occupied in society. And these roles were associated with certain norms and values. And essentially, while theorizing the kind of functioning of social order and social management, Parsons coined many of the terms that we use today, such as dysfunctionality, human capital, and human resource management, which, as I'm sure you know, is an entire kind of field of study and an entire kind of department of many workplaces, including this particular university has an HR department, as I would imagine all universities do. So, these terms are pretty commonplace, but really, I think Parsons' impact is quite overt, and it continues to this day. Parsons' work is still taught quite a bit, especially in the US, also in some parts of the global south. It's taught a bit less in Australian, British, and European sociology. So Parsons is someone who will touch upon, but not necessarily use his work too much. So as I've hinted at, there's several critiques of functionalism. It can be viewed as very deterministic. So there can be the idea that someone's role kind of determines their life outcome without giving much credence to free will and autonomy. Also, some argue that there's too much of a focus on the kind of positive functions of social systems such as families and other kind of institutions without looking enough at negative outcomes. For instance, the kind of functional role of women in a household, just looking at that as part of a kind of functional entity risks ignoring, especially in 1950s America, the oppression of women. Some people have also argued that functionalism has, or at least Parsons' version of functionalism, has a kind of ideological or even conservative bent to it. There's debate about how true this is, but that is a particularly kind of active space for debate in about the 1960s and 70s. So after now we've looked at kind of functionalism, we can think a bit about phenomenology, symbolic interactionism. So if you remember, these are approaches that look at the micro level of social life, similar to what Weber was doing through his focus on meaning and interaction. So symbolic interactionism is the kind of umbrella term that's used for much of the study of interpersonal kind of micro-level human interactions, so conversations and interactions between two people or small groups of people. And proponents of symbolic interactionism would argue that it's necessary to study social interaction in order to understand human practices. And the notion of symbolic interactionism is based very much on the idea of social reality as something that's not empirically out there in the world waiting to be discovered, not based on social laws or anything like that, but that it is instead something that is constructed and made through interaction, so through words and gestures and language. And very much following along the same line as this, symbolic interactionism would argue that the self is not something that is fixed and inherent, that our self is made and remade through our interactions with others. And so we could, to support that type of claim, the claim that the self is not fixed, we can look at how people modify their behavior when they're in front of different audiences of people. You can compare, for instance, thinking about your own life, how you might act in front of your family when you're out, like doing something social with friends, when you're at work, when you're at uni. I'm imagining that you would act quite differently in those situations to fit in with different norms and expectations that are coming from those particular environments. And so you're essentially enacting a different form of self in each environment. So this particular perspective really takes the self and personal identity as coming through one's interactions. And so it's probably unsurprising that the focus is on the interactions themselves as the thing that is studied. So one particularly kind of famous proponent of symbolic interactionism is George Herbert Mead, who was an early proponent, was a philosopher and a psychologist, and he proposed that people act kind of towards things based on the meanings that these things have for them, and that the meanings are kind of either derived from or arising out of social interactions. So again, he's arguing that things do not have an inherent meaning. They're made meaningful through social interactions. So I can now take you back to the example I gave you right at the start of the lecture for this week about money. See, banknotes are not inherently meaningful. They're only meaningful to us. They're only something that we wouldn't, just chuck out with a bunch of kind of pocket lint, because we have created that meaning. We've been taught that meaning through our interactions with others. We understand that if I go to a store and give someone this money, they'll give me something that I want. Whereas if I go up and give them just a bunch of stuff from my pocket, I very much doubt that they'll give me what I want. So, you can see from this particular example that so George Herbert Mead would argue that the meaning of everything is constructed in a really similar way through interpersonal interpretation and interaction. And he argues that we take these things and we filter them into our own understanding of the world. So the world is kind of made for us through interacting with others. And a similar approach is put forward by Irving Goffman, who is a particularly kind of fun sociologist. So he advances what can be called a dramaturgical perspective. And so he uses the metaphor of actors on a stage to talk about how people present themselves. So he contrasts between the kind of way in which you would act at the front of the stage if you were an actor, like when you're on the stage, being professional, putting your best foot forward, trying to act correctly. And then the contrast to that would be the chaos of the backstage, where bits of costume are flying everywhere and things are in disarray. And so we can find, front stage and backstage in various areas of life. An example that Goffman uses is the kind of front and back of house of a commercial kitchen. So at a restaurant, if any of you have worked in hospitality before, which was always my kind of uni job, you can contrast the absolute chaos of the kitchen to the very calm, nice, relaxed feeling dining room with all of your customers. And you can think of the the house itself can be a backstage, but if you're living with your family, maybe your bedroom's the backstage, and there's more of a kind of front stage where you're trying to put on a presentation of self, even when you're out in different parts of the house, when you're interacting with family members. So there can be various kind of layers of front and backstage, and it really refers to the way in which you are or are not performing yourself in those particular situations. This is again an approach that views identity as socially constructed, as constructed through our kind of interactions with other people. And another kind of micro theorist who is particularly interesting is Ali Hofschild, an American sociologist who founded the sociology of emotions. So she drew quite strongly on Marx's concept of alienation, but she argued that instead of being alienated necessarily from the product of our labor, if you remember, Marx argued that we become alienated from the things that we're producing. She argues that in the modern contemporary world, we can become alienated from our own emotions when we have to perform certain emotions as part of our work. So if you've ever worked in customer service, you might have a huge headache, feel really disgusting. Maybe your boss has just been really mean to you or like yelled at you or something, and you feel awful, and you still have to be really cheerful and chipper and lovely to the customers. And she would argue that that alienates you from your own emotions, because really the kind of labor that you're doing is not constructive labor that you'll do in a factory, but the labor many of us do in our contemporary lives is emotional labor or emotion work. So there's an element of classical theory being kind of carried through to our contemporary theory, although Hofschild is working very much on a micro level again. And then moving on to phenomenology. Phenomenology is another micro theory, but it's interested in the kind of internal kind of process of meaning making. So it's interested less in how we make meaning through kind of the process of interacting and more about how those interactions impact on our internal life. So it locates its object of study not in conversations between two or more people, but in the kind of thinking that an individual would do and how their understanding of their own identity might come from that, the meaning-making processes that they go through. So as I've already said, phenomenology literally means a study of consciousness, a study of how we understand our own world. So human interaction on a micro level is at issue, but it's not the focus of this type of approach. The focus is instead on individual consciousness, meaning making. And very much like any kind of discipline, any field of research, we have some relatively new characters who appear. So I've found some that you're quite likely to come across in this course, and probably some of your other courses as well. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly just because we're going to revisit the ones that are particularly important for this course, and the other ones I think you'll come across in your other courses. And I think I've already given you a lot of information to be going on with. So this is more just familiarizing you with some names that will come up again, rather than expecting you to kind of commit anything to memory, because I think you've probably done enough of that and done enough work so far. So the first one is Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist who is coming from a neo-Marxist position and is very interested in social class. And you're going to hear a lot about him in Stephen's lecture on class. So I'm not going to say too much about him, but he is a really fascinating figure. He's very widely used still in contemporary sociology. He died in 2002, so he's no longer around, but his legacy still looms large over contemporary sociology. Anthony Giddens is another one. He's still alive, and I think he's still publishing. He is interested in kind of processes of individualization, detraditionalization, how essentially he's interested in how contemporary societies are changing and how people find security in an uncertain world. He's very much interested in individual identity and how we construct our identity amid a sea of social forces. And then we have Ulrich Beck, who unfortunately died recently in 2015, which is a big loss for sociology. And Beck is interested in the concept of risk, basically. He published a very influential work directly after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, talking about how risk was managed and understood by societies, what was viewed as an acceptable risk, and how risks were managed by individuals, corporations, all sorts of things. So he's again a very interesting figure that you will most certainly come across again. I think he is going to pop up in the week on environment and society, so look out for him there. George Ritzer is, I've included him because he's really following through from the work of Max Weber. He's also interested in rationalization, bureaucratization, and he's taken the example of McDonald's, the kind of restaurant, like fast food company, as a particular example of what contemporary rationalization can look like. And he's applied this idea to a host of different institutions. If you're feeling a bit subversive, you might want to look at his article on the McDonaldization of the university. So he's a particularly interesting one. And then Michel Foucault, who you'll definitely come across again as well. I know if you're a Bachelor of Social Science student or a sociology and anthropology major, then the second year theory course covers Foucault quite in depth, so you will come across him again. He's very interested in power and the relationship between power and knowledge. So his work is quite fascinating, especially he's interested in how governments exercise power over populations and the nature of that power, and how governing bodies can make people act in the ways that they want to. So I think in our kind of contemporary era, when we have a lot of very overt government policies that are asking for quite a lot of compliance from their population, such as lockdown mandates, his work is very interesting to try to analyze, what is it that's going on here, and why does this work? Why is there potentially not more backlash, really? And then finally, moving on to some important kind of recent developments in sociology. So you're going to be hearing a bit more about feminist sociology next week in the lecture on gender and sexuality, but feminist sociology is basically interested in the workings of patriarchy and the relationship between patriarchy and contemporary capitalism. So a very famous feminist sociologist, Raewyn Connell, who's an Australian sociologist, actually works in a very interesting way in this space and does so from a Marxist perspective. Because really, feminist sociology has a lot in common with Marxist sociology in that it's taking a very conflict-driven view of society and its object of study. It's looking at conflicts between different groups of people, whether it's social classes or on the basis of gender. And then we have postcolonial theory. So this is a development that I think is has come about in dialogue with the kind of colonial origins of sociology. So you've probably noticed that our founding fathers, as well as all being men, they are all very, very white. So postcolonial theory is really a response to the very kind of narrow view that the kind of narrow experience, narrow view of the world that came through in early sociology, and it focuses on not only kind of different perspectives, but it also focuses on the kind of aftermath and continuing legacy of colonialism and the kind of impact that has had, and the current conditions of people living in post-colonial countries in the global south. And we'll think a bit more about this in the week that we focus on globalization. So I can just about leave it there, but I'm sure you've all heard just about as much as you can keep in your heads about sociological theory. I just want to reiterate, you do not need to stress about trying to understand and remember all of these theories. I really just want you to remember the kind of general big picture moves that are being made. So the kind of classic theorists and how the paradigms that they advance are maybe taken up in contemporary work, and just the really broad kind of difference between macro and micro theory, or the difference between kind of conflict and functionalist types of theories. So please don't try to commit all of this to memory. It's really supposed to be a broad overview, and then as we work through the weeks of this course, as I've indicated, we're going to touch upon many of these theorists and kind of shine a spotlight on their particular work as it relates to the themes that we're covering. So you'll see in a much more detailed way how they fit into the bigger picture of the discipline. And so the big factors of sociological analysis that we're focusing on in this course and in much sociological work are class, race, and gender. So we'll keep coming back to them as kind of examples and as touchstones in our work with sociological theories. But yes, ultimately, please do not stress about all of the information. I think just take the kind of higher level stuff from this particular lecture, and just know the next time you come across this material, it will be a bit familiar to you, and it will be much easier to fill in the blanks, essentially. So thank you so much for sticking with it, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in my next lecture. Have a great week.